Why did it take this long for us to get rid of our plastic cutting boards?
This is the Earth Day Party Podcast with Shannon Burns and Sarah Christie. Get in, bestie. We're going to clean up the planet.
Hi, I'm Shannon.
And I'm Sarah.
And welcome back to another episode of the Earth Day Party, where we dive into so many conversations with experts about the planet, sustainability, and what we can really do to make a difference.
Microplastics is probably a word you've read, you've heard of, Shannon, but what do you actually know about microplastics?
Prior to this episode, I didn't really know much, and I think it really showed me just how little I actually know about it. You do hear that word constantly, and plastic really is all around us. But yeah, I didn't know much. How much did you know?
No, same. You hear it all the time, and I'm assuming it's scary and a bad thing because it's under the umbrella of a form of plastic. I know that's on the beaches and when we wash our clothes, but beyond that, it's a big mystery. But here are some of the headlines, okay, when we were prepping for this interview with Ziya Tong that I flagged, because these are the types of things that can just send you into such a doom scroll state. Your brain could have a spoon's worth of microplastics. Like, what are you supposed to do with that information?
Literally.
Okay.
And is it making us more dumb? And how do we get that out of our brains? It just leads to even more questions about microplastic. I feel like even prepping for this interview too, we were just sending those headlines back and forth to each other, being like, wait, did you know this? We should ask her about this.
It was a vicious cycle.
It was really a vicious cycle. And then we watched the documentary that our guest actually created, which is all about microplastics. So even in that, we learned so much more as well.
And that's why some of these headlines, another one, we consume up to a credit card's worth of plastic every week. Tips to stop microplastics from getting into my body. It's one thing to see these and then just take that information away and go into there's nothing I can do. But Ziya Tong went and got answers for us. She's an award-winning science broadcaster, author of The Reality Bubble, which is a book I will recommend to literally anyone who is listening. She is a brilliant storyteller. She just tells stories in a way that your jaw drops. It's so picturesque, but it's probably some serious information that you need to know. And like you mentioned, Shannon, now the director of the documentary, Plastic People, The Hidden Crisis of Microplastics.
Another headline that I saw going into this interview is that Ziya is the first person on camera to have her fecal matter tested on camera, which is definitely something that we ask her about in this interview as well. Should we get into it?
Let's do it.
We thought to start, if it would be possible for you just to define some terminology for those who are listening. Can you define what microplastics are?
Microplastics are, in essence, tiny pieces, tiny shards of plastic that have broken down. So, if you see something like a Barbie doll, eventually it's going to get broken down by the sun, by wind, by waves, by mechanical forces, and just about all the plastic that we see in the world today, it never disappears. It just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces.
And I think it's important to really touch on that and kind of paint the picture of it, because like your book, The Reality Bubble, which talks about all of these dangers that are invisible to us but are so harmful, it's easy for us to just hear these terms and then go, okay, so what? Like, I don't see it, right? And so with that, can you also define forever chemicals? Because that's a big one when we're understanding microplastics, if I'm following.
Yeah. So, a lot of plastics are made up of various chemicals. So whether it's phthalates that make the plastics kind of bendy or other chemical properties. And the problem with that is that a lot of those those chemicals, those PFAS chemicals, are toxic. So you've got plastic when you ingest it, when you breathe it, when you eat it, when you drink it, and ultimately that plastic, when it finds itself into your body, starts releasing some of those toxic chemicals inside of your system. So it's like having millions of little poison pills inside of your body that are on slow release. If you take medicine and it slow releases some of that medicine into your system, with plastics, it's slow releasing toxins and poisons into your system, essentially.
That was so shocking to learn that I knew that we're ingesting microplastics with things that we're eating and different products that we're using, but I had no idea that we were breathing in microplastics. So, and I love also that you were the first ever person to film the testing of your own excrements and having them on what plastic does to your body. So what did you discover having this done?
Yeah, well, gosh, I mean, filming my own fecal samples is the least glamorous thing any human being can do. And seeing that on the big screen is also something where you're like, oh gosh, how do I invite my friends to this film? But yeah, I did test my fecal samples. I tested my blood as well. And I think one of the shocking things is ultimately what you don't see, you know, with fecal samples, with poop, it comes out of your system, right? But with blood, I think one of the things that really shocked me was the fact that they took a sample that was about half a teaspoon, tiny, 2.5 milliliters, right? And that's what they were testing. And inside of that 2.5 milliliters on average, they were finding about 11 microplastic particles for that tiny sample. And if you think about it, I have 5 liters of blood coursing through my body. So what's shocking for me is how much is actually circulating in my system. Sure, they took 11 microplastic particles out and put it on a screen, but what's in my body? And then just to answer what you were asking about, us breathing microplastics in, a recent study, that was looking at how we're getting it into the brain is through breathing it. It goes right up into the nose, nostrils, into the olfactory bulb, and that's how it's actually entering, in part, our brains. And, that microplastic is absolutely everywhere in every breath that we take, and it's coming from, really, really innocuous things that you wouldn't even suspect, like carpet fibers or clothing fibers, right? So it's a really big invisible threat. And I think the thing that we need to drive home is the threat comes from the same place, whether it's the climate crisis or whether it's the microplastic crisis. They're twin sides of the same coin, which is ultimately the oil and gas industry, right? Oil and gas creates carbon dioxide that we can't see, and that, basically it's coming out of tailpipes, coming out of buildings, and it's invisible to the naked eye. And the same thing with microplastics, which are created from oil and gas. And they're invisible as well. But these are some of the greatest threats to humanity and other, wildlife as well today.
Yeah, it is so shocking to know that, like, no matter what you do, you're going to be ingesting microplastics. We both threw out our cutting boards as soon as we learning more about it. The way that you describe, like, if you cut on a plastic cutting board, you're pretty much like peppering your meal in plastic, which is so shocking. So we know that there's ways that you can prevent some microplastics getting into your body, but are there ways to actually like shed the microplastics from your body?
Unfortunately, the science isn't there yet, and we haven't really come across that yet. So the studies are really new. I think one of the only thing that I came across which seemed to be preventative was boiling your water. So there's, calcification in your water. You see that, with kettles or what have you. And so what happens when you boil the water is you can kind of boil up and kind of condense some of those microplastic particles. And, if you basically get rid of some of that, you can drink your water and assume that some of it is a little more safe to drink. But no, in terms of how it's getting through our system, our organs do a good job. We do know that it looks like they're filtering some of it through, like we were saying, like, the food that you eat, most of that microplastic will pass through your system. But at the end of the day, we're starting to see it in the human brain now, and there's no place for that to go. That doesn't get flushed out in some magical other system. So the best thing that we can do is stop it and prevent it from getting into our bodies. And the best way we do that is by reducing the amount of single-use plastic in the world that we just don't really need. Like, my grandparents lived without it. So it's not one of those things that we don't think we can do as human beings, right?
So now that the documentary is out, you filmed, you went through all the testing. I'm curious, well, first of all, what shocked you the most, but also now that it's wrapped, how are you moving differently now that you have all these test results?
Like I said, the shocking thing is what you don't see. And I think another sort of shocking thing after you work on a film like that is how you see it everywhere at the same time. It's a little bit like punch buggy, that where you see a VW, a red VW, and you have to hit someone, I guess. But it's the same thing for me now. I look everywhere, and where I didn't see plastic before, I look at paint and I see plastic. I look at chewing gum, I see plastic. Cigarette butts, I see plastic. Carpeting, I see plastic. Yoga pants, I see plastic. So all these invisibilized forms of plastic that normally I just didn't think of them as plastic before. Now they're like glaring kind of klaxons coming at me, and I can see that plastic a lot more clearly than I could in the past. And then the other thing too is, of course, traveling to the global south, traveling to, places like Manila, where I saw shocking amounts of plastic. But I think the surprise is how how we're actually seeing a lot of leadership from the global south. So another place that I traveled to last year was Rwanda. Rwanda is, and I've traveled a lot. I've been to a lot of countries. It's been a great fortune. Rwanda is probably one of the cleanest places I've ever been to. I would certainly say on par with Singapore, perhaps even cleaner. It didn't matter where I was, whether I was in the urban centers or just way out in the middle of, small villages, spotless, absolutely spotless. And they were the ones who got rid of plastic years and years ago, especially single-use plastic bags, and that stopped clogging up their systems. So I think that some of the surprising things that people may not expect is that, you can be in Africa or even in Manila and see the remarkable changes and strides that they've made. So if those countries can make those wonderful changes, even though places like Manila, for example, have been export hubs where we have been sending our plastic trash, then we certainly should be able to step up and do a better job too.
How do you feel like we can change the conversation with everyday people around it? Because I feel like people still laugh at the fact that we have to use like paper straws. And I saw a woman one time at a grocery store like throw a fit because they no longer offered plastic bags. So I feel like it's still something that people don't want to get on board with in the conversation, especially here in Canada.
I think that it's actually sometimes a little less polarizing than we think because people don't like garbage. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left or on the right. I think the plastic straws argument is very weaponized by certain groups, but I think that we have to remind people that, you don't want garbage. You don't want to see, like for me, literally seeing other people's garbage and plastic bags in your blood or in your kid's blood, for example, right? So garbage is not particularly polarizing. I think trash, litter, garbage, we need to remind people that we don't need to be making so much of it. I feel a little bit more optimistic in some ways about being able to change the conversation if we can point it out.
Before we get into ways, more opportunity to feel optimistic, I do want to ask, what are the microplastics doing in our body? Because we hear that they're in there, and I look at a cigarette package and there's a warning on it, so I know kind of why it's bad to smoke cigarettes. But I hear the microplastics are in my body, and what does that mean? And I heard you say this term that I just wrote when we were prepping for the interview. I just wrote WTF. It was babies are being born polluted. How do you wrap your head around that piece of information, and what does that mean for our health?
One thing, well, there's been a few studies that have come out recently, and again, the science is new, but it's not looking good, right? So they did do a study that was looking at cardiovascular plaques. And what they were finding was that people who had these microplastics inside of these plaques were at 4.5 greater risk of heart attack, stroke, or even death. And another study that came out very recently was looking at people who had dementia and had Alzheimer's. And it was a small sample there, but even in this beginning sort of nascent early study, they had 10 times more microplastic in their brains than people with healthy brain tissue. So, scientists are always very cautious, so they can't necessarily speak to causality in that way. They can't say the microplastics are causing dementia, but certainly it should sound some alarm bells. You should be like, oh my gosh, this is a problem. So I haven't come across any studies yet that are like, gee whiz, microplastics, this is great. You know what I mean? If they're in your body, and as we said earlier, they contain toxins. And they're also jagged, right? Keep in mind, these are flecks of materials that have broken down. They're not like, perfectly smooth. They lodge into your system, and they can also cause inflammation. And inflammation, especially repeated inflammation, can cause cancer. So there are some serious things to be thinking about here. And I think it's just really, really important. And I hope people get a chance to see the film Plastic People, because there's something very, very different about seeing microplastic in the human body rather than reading about it, rather than reading statistics. It's much more visceral, I would say.
Yeah, I think especially because it is so invisible too. So it's just almost like this theory that you hear about, but you don't actually see it. So you don't see what it's actually doing to us. Based on what you were just saying, is there any legislation that's coming out to combat any of this?
That's such an important question as well. And I think you guys know that the plastics treaty is ongoing. So we actually showed screen plastic people in Ottawa for INC4, which was the delegates that had all come together from around the world, the environment ministers. Then we shared it again in Busan, Korea for INC5. Now, the treaty negotiations and talks are currently on hold, on pause. They're going to get together another time to finalize that treaty. So this is kind of like the Paris Agreement. This is the world's people coming together to stop, the unnecessary use of plastics. There's some plastics used in surgeries, for example, that we're still going to continue to use in medicine. I wear contact lenses, but it's really this useless, because the thing is we also can't recycle it. As you guys probably know by now, only 9% of plastics globally are recycled. And that 9%, you can only recycle it once or twice, and then it becomes trash again, entering into the food that we eat, the air that we breathe, and the water we drink. So we have to do something. I'm glad to know people are doing something, but we have to also fight those forces. There are forces here in Canada that are trying to bring back plastics. Be very wary of politicians who are trying to do that. Trump is trying to do that right now, and that's because they're in the pocket of big oil and gas, right? So pay attention to those people who are rattling the cage trying to bring back plastic straws. They're on the wrong side of history, for sure.
Yeah.
So how can people take action at home? Because there has to, I heard Rick Smith, executive producer of Plastic People, say that 50% of the plastic on Earth was made in the last 15 years. And Shannon and I were talking, 15 years ago, we were listening to LMFAO. Like, that's very recent. That feels like we remember 15 years ago. So it feels like, to me, that's a piece of hope that goes, oh, we can change this, because that's a familiar time.
Yeah, like, this is new.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. That's exactly how I see it too. So much happens within a generation. We were trained to use plastics in a generation. The oil and gas industry and marketers kind of started getting us to start to throw things away. Initially, and you'll see this in the film, we didn't want to throw things away. People would take a cup and use it again and again and again. And then we had to be trained to throw it out each and every time. So I think within a generation, we can certainly retrain ourselves back to quality over quantity. I often think about things like antiques. The reason we have antiques is because our grandparents and our great-grandparents handed down quality items. They weren't handing down plastic crap to their grandkids, right? So, I think one of the easiest things you can do is buy quality, buy something amazing that you love a lot, that you can see using again and again, and something that you can see passing down to future generations as well.
Wow. I feel like I've learned so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, for the documentary, for sharing, and for putting your body on the line for all of this. So we now know about something that's invisible.
Yeah.
Thank you for the great work that you guys are doing as well.
That was such an insightful conversation with Ziya. I feel like it has changed how I just view plastic in general. Don't you think?
Right after we did that interview, I was in such a conflicted state because I don't like buying new things, especially if I don't need them. And I have containers, food storage containers at home, but all of them were plastic. And after that interview, I was like, no, I got to go replace these with glass. So I went to a store and I bought glass containers, and I am so clumsy and drop everything. So now I'm walking like little baby steps everywhere I go, but they had to go. And so I don't know, the plastic containers are still in the house. I'll figure out a use for them. I don't know if I'm going to get rid of them entirely. Maybe I'll find, but it's everywhere. What about you?
Literally is everywhere. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say that this conversation and that documentary, it's changed the way that I see plastic in the world. Knowing that it's going to stay around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, really makes me second guess about all the packaging that I get in the mail, everything that I am touching, and all the plastic that I'm like coming in contact with every single day. It has totally changed everything. And I feel like now I'm becoming like I'm preaching it constantly to everyone that I'm around. I was just in the States last week and they have so much single-use plastic and it's so thick as well that I'm like, this actually isn't, there's no such thing as single-use plastic because plastic lasts forever. Did you know that? And all my friends are like, okay, Shannon, what has gotten into you? So
yeah, okay, so us being in the industry of just live entertainment, we've been backstage quite a few times, and that's a place where plastic exists and is always there. Weren't you just backstage at a live taping? What was that like?
yeah, and so I was in the green room for my friend, and she has a rider on her list, so she gets different food every night, and it comes in all these plastic containers, and sometimes she doesn't even get to eating the food. So I'm like, I'll take this with me back to my hotel. Like, I'll make sure that I eat this food, and that way this plastic doesn't go to waste. And there's just so many, especially in the States, so much single-use plastic. So that, yeah, it really just blows your mind once your eyes are so open to it.
Well, we did go see the documentary Plastic People after, and there was a Q&A with Ziya Tong, and what my big takeaway was actually how hopeful Ziya was, in that there's so many resources and actionable steps that are shared in the documentary, but also on their website, plasticpeopledoc.com. Did you leave feeling, was I alone in that? Were you feeling hopeful after that Q&A?
I felt so hopeful. I think because of people like her who are doing things and raising awareness about it, I think knowledge is power. So I think the more conversations that we have just like this one is really what's going to spark the change in our future. Something that I actually learned in the research for this conversation was that you can actually just like change your laundry setting, and that can help with microplastics, right?
Right, because they're leaking when we wash our clothes into the water system. So Ziya had recommended just changing the cycle to a gentle cycle, so it's not as harsh and not bleeding. What did she say? 70%. It's 70% less microplastics.
That's something that is so simple to be able to do. I think I went into this conversation thinking, what can I as one lone person do to make a difference? But I really think that if we all just tweak things that we do every day, that's going to help in such a huge way. So that's definitely what I took away from the conversation.
Well, and also, like she said, if we stop relying on single-use plastics as heavily as our society does, that also puts a burden on the industries that are telling us we need them, that we need to be dependent on them. Because I think what's so easy to forget is that we have purchasing power as an individual. Where we put our money is what we support. So if you don't support microplastics or bleeding into your body, then, stop spending your money on them wherever you can. I know, easier said than done sometimes.
For sure. But even knowing that single-use plastic is like a form of consumerism, I'm like, no one wants that, right? So let's cut it out and not fall into those pressures all around us. So,
and here's something pretty inspiring, actually. This blew my mind. So in the interview, Ziya mentions quickly Bayfield, Ontario. You also see way more about it if you go see the documentary. But Bayfield, Ontario is a community, the first plastic-free community in North America. So because why not? I connected with someone from Bayfield after we did this interview because I was just so intrigued. I wanted to learn more. That was actually completely community-driven. They had no support from their municipality.
Wow.
So no government interference at all. It was completely just book clubs, libraries, restaurants all getting together and going, this is something we really care about. And they did that as a community.
That's so hopeful because that means that we can do it too, right? In our own community. So what are you going to change the most after this conversation?
Oh gosh. Well, I'm really into gardening. And if you're a gardener, there's plastic everywhere. And so even where the little trays are plastic, maybe I can try and find glass alternatives or just something that isn't plastic, especially when I'm growing food. That's a big one. But also learning from Bayfield. Maybe there's some groups I can be tapping into in my city and going, hey, is this something you care about?
Totally.
What about you?
I am never going to complain about using a paper straw for the rest of my life. From that moment, I was like, okay, well, this is helping the planet, and it's a little thing that I can do to really help out. I've been wanting to get outside more, so I really think, too, it's inspired me to go out and just pick up garbage because there's so much plastic around. We know how harmful that can be for different animals, so I think that's what I'm going to do as well, just to do that little bit, right? If we all do it, then it'll create something bigger.
Another piece of information and advice that she shared, again, when we were prepping for this interview was if you have the old, non-stick pans, and they aren't, a lot of them now say if they're chemical free, whatnot, give you all the labels. But if they have scratches on them, to get rid of them because those scratches mean that they're just leaking the plastics and the chemicals into your food.
Oh, that's so wild.
And like we mentioned, plasticpeopledoc.com is the website for the documentary. So if you are interested in learning more and taking action as an individual, there's no shortage of resources there.
Thanks so much for listening. I'm Shannon.
And I'm Sarah, and thank you so much for coming out to the Earth Day party.
Earth Day Party Podcast is in support of WWF Canada. Help protect wildlife and fight climate change during Earth Month with a gift to WWF Canada. You can give now at wwf.ca/earthmonth.